a 104% tariff on Chinese imports, a number that felt less like economics and more like a declaration of war. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stepped before the cameras, her words sharp as a blade. China's retaliation was a significant error, she declared, her tone echoing the resolve of an administration unwilling to blink.
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m. tonight, so effectively tomorrow. Yes. Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States. He believes China has to make a deal with the United States. It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight. But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started. And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
Outside the White House, rain lashed against the windows as if nature itself foresaw the storm ahead. It began with a stalemate. For months, the US and China had been locked in a high-stakes game of chicken, each refusing to fold their cards. China's 34% tariffs on American soybeans and semiconductors had drawn blood, but Washington's counterpunch, a new 50% duty stacked atop existing levies, was a knockout blow. "We're reclaiming our future," former President Trump had thundered days earlier, flanked by steelworkers in hard hats. "Every dollar they send us is a bullet we'll fire back." By dawn, markets were in freefall. The S&P 500 teetered on the edge of bear territory while factory owners from Shenzhen to Seattle scrambled to reroute supply chains. In Beijing, state media denounced the move as economic bullying, but behind closed doors, officials whispered of contingency plans, rerouting exports through Belt and Road allies, stockpiling rare earth metals, and doubling down on AI-driven manufacturing. Meanwhile, in Madrid and Seoul, diplomats feverishly drafted trade pacts, desperate to sidestep the crossfire. Somewhere in Ohio, a third-generation auto parts supplier stared at a spreadsheet, his margins evaporating like morning dew. In Guangzhou, a factory owner lit a cigarette, watching shipments pile up at the docks. "We'll survive," he muttered, though his hands trembled. Across the globe, the same question hung in the air: how long until someone breaks? The implementation of a 104% tariff on Chinese goods will dramatically reshape the daily lives of American consumers by driving up prices across essential categories. From groceries to electronics, fresh produce, dairy, and other perishables could see immediate price hikes within a week, while dry goods, alcohol, and clothing may surge within months, with retailers already adding tariff fees at checkout. Over the coming year, back-to-school shoppers could face sticker shock as footwear and apparel prices jump by roughly a third, while appliances, which saw 11 to 34% increases under previous tariffs, and electronics like smartphones will gradually become more expensive as pre-tariff inventories dwindle. Automobiles and repairs are also expected to rise significantly, potentially adding thousands of dollars to vehicle costs within months. This cascading effect will strain household budgets further as higher prices ripple into insurance premiums, rentals, and service costs, compounding existing inflation pressures. To cope, consumers are likely to adopt aggressive strategies like coupon reliance, bulk buying of non-perishables, and cashback card optimization to mitigate the financial squeeze. With 75% of Americans already bracing for steeper everyday expenses, the tariff's long-term impact could force lasting changes in spending habits and financial planning. The 104% tariff on Chinese goods could lead to long-term consequences that further strain US-China relations. Economically, the tariffs will likely deepen the trade conflict, reducing bilateral trade volumes and forcing both countries to adjust their supply chains, which can be costly and disruptive. China's retaliation may target US imports, intensifying economic tensions and pushing China to accelerate its efforts toward technological self-reliance while seeking stronger ties with Europe, East Asia, and the global South. Politically, the tariffs reinforce a shift in US trade policy from economic liberalization to protectionism, using trade measures as national security tools. This approach could solidify mutual distrust between the two nations and reduce opportunities for diplomatic cooperation. Additionally, the tariffs may encourage other nations to align with either the US or China, potentially creating broader geopolitical divisions. Overall, these tariffs risk entrenching adversarial dynamics in US-China relations while reshaping global trade and alliances. The world is bracing for impact as nations scramble to respond to the latest US tariffs, with reactions ranging from fiery defiance to cautious diplomacy. At the heart of the storm is China, where top leaders held emergency meetings to stabilize markets and counter what state media calls economic blackmail. Vowing to fight to the end, Beijing announced a first 34%, second 84% reciprocal tariff ***, signaling an escalation in the trade war. Across the Atlantic, the European Union is preparing its own counterstrike, a 25% levy on U.S. soybeans and motorcycles, while European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen pushes for a different solution: zero tariffs between the U.S. and EU to avoid a global recession. Nearby, Canada isn't holding back, slapping $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American autos and other goods, with Prime Minister Mark Carney bluntly calling the U.S. unreliable. In Mexico, the response has taken a different turn. Rather than immediate trade retaliation, the government deployed troops to fentanyl-producing border zones and extradited cartel leaders, a move seen as an attempt to ease tensions. Meanwhile, Japan and South Korea are opting for dialogue, sending trade delegations to Washington in hopes of negotiation. The strategy seems to be working, for now, as Japan's Nikkei surged 6% after leaders agreed to talks. Smaller economies are maneuvering carefully. Vietnam, eager to avoid conflict, has offered zero tariffs on U.S. goods if Washington reciprocates. Australia, too, is sidestepping confrontation, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese refusing retaliation to prevent price hikes and economic slowdown. India remains watchful, monitoring developments before making its next move. In Europe, leaders are taking divergent paths. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is set to visit Washington next week for direct talks, while Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez heads to China and Vietnam, reassessing trade alliances in real time. And then there's Russia, oddly untouched by the new tariffs, not out of goodwill, but because existing sanctions have already severed most trade ties. Still, $3 billion in annual exports, including fertilizers and platinum, remain in limbo. As the global chessboard shifts, one thing is clear: the trade war is far from over, and every move risks tipping the world closer to recession. The US-China trade war has significantly impacted several key industries, with semiconductors being one of the hardest-hit sectors. China's tariffs target $10 billion in annual US chip exports, affecting major players like Intel, which derives 29% of its revenue from China, and Micron, whose memory chips face heightened trade barriers. The aviation industry is also under pressure as Boeing risks losing business with Chinese airlines, Air China, China Eastern, and China Southern, which had planned deliveries of 179 jets through 2027 but now face increased costs due to tariffs. Agriculture has been another major casualty, with U.S. soybeans, a critical export to China, and livestock feed hit with 10 to 15% tariffs, compounded by the suspension of 3 U.S. soybean exporters over contamination claims. The energy sector has also suffered as China's 10 to 15% tariffs on U.S. coal, LNG, and crude oil disrupt exports to one of America's largest markets. Meanwhile, manufacturing hubs in the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, and the Pacific Northwest are grappling with cascading costs from retaliatory tariffs and supply chain shifts. Pharmaceuticals face additional risks as U.S. drug makers may lose access to Chinese manufacturing amid pressure from the Trump administration to relocate production. Beyond these industries, broader risks loom. Apple, for instance, faces higher costs for China-made iPhones, which account for 9% of U.S. imports from China, contributing to a 20% stock decline. Construction and mining firms report supply chain diversification and reduced hiring due to tariff exposure. Strategically, over 50% of U.S. manufacturers are actively seeking alternative suppliers or accelerating purchases to mitigate the tariffs' impact, signaling a long-term shift in global trade dynamics. Despite mounting criticism, Donald Trump is aggressively expanding tariffs, including a minimum 104% rate on Chinese goods and new, reciprocal tariffs targeting 57 nations, such as 20% on the EU, 24% on Japan, and 46% on Vietnam, claiming these measures will rebalance global trade and revive U.S. manufacturing while dismissing market turmoil as short-term pain for long-term gain. His plans also include a significant, though unspecified, tariff on pharmaceutical imports, framed as part of a broader strategy to generate revenue and reduce reliance on foreign goods. However, over 70% of CEOs predict a potential recession within a year, with analysts warning of economic instability and retaliatory measures from trading partners like China, which has already imposed 34% tariffs in response. Allies in Europe and Asia face steep new trade barriers, risking diplomatic strain and a cycle of escalation. Critics, including GOP lawmakers and business leaders, argue the approach could trigger job losses, inflation, and electoral backlash, with figures like Ted Cruz cautioning against a bloodbath for the economy and Republican political prospects. Despite bipartisan concerns and market volatility, Trump remains defiant, framing tariffs as an honor and a cornerstone of his America First agenda.